Hi, everybody. I'm Eve Harow, September 15th, 2017, just a few days before Rosh Hashanah. And I'm sitting once again with Dr. Harold Rhode. What can you do? There's just some people who know a lot about a lot of different things, and we keep circling back to them. You might remember that a couple of months ago, I interviewed him on his new book, Modern Islamic Warfare and Ancient Doctrine Marches On. But I came back to him again because something that he was very much involved with was just on the news this week, and I thought it was very important to get this back out there. The Iraqi Jewish archives, which Dr. Rhode was very, very involved with getting saved, are now apparently going to be returned to Iraq. So, Dr. Rhode, first of all, thank you for making time to come on the Land of Israel Network once again. Oh, did I introduce myself? Eve Harow, Rejuvenation for the Land of Israel Network? I don't even think I remember to do that. Anyhow, guys, here we are with Dr. Rhode.
Hi, Eve, nice to be with you. It's interesting times, and this is a very interesting subject.
So it seems like it's always interesting times in the world, either from, hurricanes or who knows what happening. But there's a lot of man-made disasters. I talked about a little bit about this last week. But for those who don't remember the story, and a few years ago when it first happened, I interviewed Tufik Bolaner, I think I just made a total mess up of his name, who was one of the American, actually Muslim soldiers who was with you at the time. And that was a terrific interview if any of you want to go back into the archives and listen to that. But I wanted to give a little bit of background, what the archives are, what you were doing there, and why we are where we are today.
Well, way back during the Iraq War, which was in 2003, all of a sudden I get a phone call, and Judith Miller of the New York Times get a phone call from a wonderful human being by the name of Ahmed Chalabi. He ran the Iraqi opposition. It's a man I known for 12 years, and much as though many in government didn't like him because they couldn't control him, he and I got along just beautifully because he defended his views. And the other thing was, besides the idea of loving American values, he also had a soft spot in his heart for the Jews. His parents, in 1941, when there was a upheaval, a pogrom against the Jews in Baghdad, the Farhud, his parents saved Jews. He never told me about it. It was some Jews that were saved by them who told me about it. And
so what was your position at the time? What were you involved with in 2003?
Well, I had worked for the Office Secretary of Defense in the United States as an advisor on Islamic affairs, and I went to Iraq under the Coalition Provisional Authority. I think that's the right name. It's a long time ago, 2003. And one of the things I was doing was basically helping in the transition to try to bring about an inclusive government in Iraq. Inclusive means Kurds, Shiites, Arab Sunnis, and Arab Shiites. And
so give us a little context for those of us for whom things are moving so quickly that it's hard to keep track. What's going on in Iraq in 2003?
Well, Saddam we liberated Iraq from the yoke of Saddam. There's a long phrase. A lot of people thought that we went there under false pretenses. Here was a man who was developing nuclear weapons and had everything ready, waiting for the opportunity that the United Nations and the United States would be bored and leave them. And then since they had the whole infrastructure established, overnight they would be able, overnight, within a month or so, develop nuclear weapons, and it would therefore put America and America's allies in the Middle East at great risk. Sort of what seems to be happening right now with North Korea and American allies South Korea and Japan. And for that matter, they might eventually even hit the American mainland. Anyway, so I was part of this group of people that appointed by the Pentagon to work for the transition. Unfortunately, we didn't do a particularly good job, And I would argue that the reason for that is American bureaucratic infighting even more than Iraqi infighting. At times it seems that there was a battle between the State Department and the CIA on one side and the Pentagon on the other. No, that's a topic for another time. But the bureaucratic infighting was just awful, absolutely awful. Now, in the meantime, one day, Judith Miller and I got phone calls from Ahmad Chalabi, the head of the Iraqi opposition, that someone had come and reported to them he had been in charge in the Iraqi secret police. That includes the equivalent of the FBI and the CIA in the United States, that he had come and he was head of both the Israel section and the Jewish section. Now, it's logical that Israel was an enemy of Iraq, and so there would be a Jewish section. Excuse me, an Israel section. But a Jewish section? Why should there have been a Jewish section in the Iraqi secret police?
Are there any Jews since, let's say, since Israel was founded in 1948? The Farhud is in 41. Israel's founded in 48. Most Iraqi Jews leave Iraq, come to Israel. Is there a significant population there these days?
I'd be surprised if there are only 3 or 4 people, if there are that many. What happened was that in 1951, if I'm correct, the entire Iraqi Jewish community, with the exception of about 7,000 people, that is over 150,000 people, immigrated to Israel. Some went to London, a few went to the United States. And that becomes important for the reason we're having this conversation of who owns the archive that this Iraqi security employee was managing. And almost everybody came here. The Iraqis threw them out, stole all of their personal property, and left them high and dry with nothing. Frankly, most of the Iraqi Jews did very well within 5 years or so in Israel and reestablishing themselves.
But they were refugees on every level. And some of these families had been there, we could even say, not just hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years, because Iraq is Babylon, and the first temple, which is destroyed in minus 586. A lot of Jews go to Babylon and don't come back. So this is a Jewish community very much rooted in the area that are thrown out with nothing. Another interview I'd done a few years ago with Lynn Julius speaking about, and that's a whole other subject, about the lack of concern or even knowledge about the Jewish refugees of the Middle East who came, many to Israel or to other places, with the clothes on their back, and nobody took care of them, yet they've managed to get back on their feet. Okay, so Iraq has no Jews 2003, yet has a Jewish archive, and you are part of this few group of people who manages to get in there.
Well, along with Tufik that you mentioned before, Junie Miller and a weapons of mass destruction team who happened to have been in the area came to see what was going on, and I came to see what's going on. And Tufik and some of his friends literally went underwater because the whole archives was underwater. The reason it was underwater is America had bombed the building where the archives was. We didn't know it existed. That was the central headquarters of Iraqi intelligence. Now, a live bomb, which I don't remember, was it a ton or 2-ton bomb? It was unbelievable. Went through the building, and instead of exploding, it went through the building, destroyed the water system, and came out right outside through a hole that it made in the building and lodged in the ground right outside where the Jewish archives was being kept.
It didn't explode?
It did not explode. And even though I worked at the Pentagon for 28 years, I'm not a military man. I didn't know exactly that this was a live bomb. And I worked personally on this for about 6 weeks, and nothing exploded. And frankly, there are so many, if you wish, coincidences or miracles which took place to help save this archives, that, something else might have been going on beyond our understanding, let's say.
As usual, yes.
As it seems in life is much the case. Anyway, I was there and I worked on this archives. I begged the American government, the American civilian authorities at the time, to help me with this project. And they weren't interested. They weren't allowed to be interested by the American government. So Chalabi asked me, what do I want to do with this? And I said, well, we have no choice. We knew there were holy books. We know there was at least one Torah. And working on saving these things in Judaism is like saving a life. And so Ahmad Chalabi funded it at first out of his own pocket. He found a truck to help get the water out. Now the water was up to our waist level, let's say, and it kept having to be drained because it was constantly dropping down to the bottom, and the archives happened to have been in the basement. Why? We can only speculate it was in the basement. Anyway, for 6 weeks, it was a labor of love. With these workers that Dr. Chalabi had hired and myself, we managed to get a lot of the material out, and we had to put it on the ground. There was really no electricity. There was some... In Iraq, it was very intermittent. We had, I think, unintentionally destroyed the electric system, but eventually everything worked out there. So for 6 months, the American government wouldn't help me. But two amazing things happened. Natan Sharansky, who at the time was a minister in the Israeli government, whom I knew would call me from time to time to see if I was alive. And when I told him what we had found, he said, hey, is there anything I can do? I said, yeah, please do. I said, the way the American government becomes interested in things, the administration, is if somebody on high recognizes. I said, you're good friends with Vice President Cheney. Give him a call. Tell him about this. At the same time, a former boss of mine and sort of an older brother named Richard Pearl, who was a great figure during the Reagan administration, and worked for Senator Henry M. Jackson before, he would also call and to see how I was doing. And I said, Richard, please call Secretary Rumsfeld and tell him what we found. The moment that in the intergovernment meetings, Secretary Rumsfeld and Vice President Cheney expressed interest in this archives, the American authorities, that is in Baghdad, that is the civilian and the military authorities, took the project over. And I want to tell you that anything the American government puts its heart and soul into, it can do. It's an amazing institution. So they went from stop bothering me type of things, you're a nuisance, to they took over the project. They were able to, with again, only American resources and abilities. They went in the second day of Shavuot. They went in, they drained the water, they blocked off this area, drained the water, and took the rest of the books that we hadn't managed to get out yet and put them in trunks, in metal aluminum trunks that Ahmad Chalabi had managed to procure for us. In the end, there were approximately 2,700 items. Wow. The items included not only holy books, but some of the communal registers of the Jews of Baghdad, especially in the last years of Jewish existence there. There were decisions that the community made, records of these things. There were lists of Jews who lived there, and again, in the Middle East, you only count the men. You're really not supposed to be counting women, so we found lists of Jews, and they ended up being from that same time period. There were religious books galore. Since at first, in the beginning, I had really, and I maybe have a PhD in history, but I'm not I don't understand very much about restoration, how to handle this. And so I was given instructions at the time. I had a friend who knew the head of restoration at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and the head of the restoration is telling me what I need to do to preserve these archives. First of all, they must be kept in the cold. Well, there was no electricity, so we couldn't even have air conditioning. So how
If
could
it's Shavuot, it's June, it's end of May, June.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. It was from late April to mid-June that I worked on this, and then I was sent back by the United States government to the United States. Anyway, I'm telling you, electricity, air conditioning, nothing. We have no idea. It was in the shade at times, almost upwards of 120 degrees in Baghdad in the summer. And there was no way of getting air conditioning to preserve them. So I did what I could. In the end, they said, look, do what you can. There were Torahs that I had to lay out on the ground. No, you can't put a Torah on the ground. You're supposed to fast for 40 days, and let's say I'm a bit pudgy. That would, that would be way beyond my pudginess. Well, I got a rabbinic ruling that since saving a Torah is like saving a life, that if this was the only way I could do it, you lay it out, you dry it out until it's damp, and that way it's the skin that it is, the parchment that it is written on, is still flexible and doesn't destroy it. Because if you try to dry out leather, that's it. It's like you're in a straitjacket. Anyway, so
was there any discussion at any point of getting it to Israel where the people do know how to restore these things and could save them? Or this was a total American project, even though it was the Jewish archives, and which was kind of mixed up together with the Israeli section? Did that come up at all?
It did, and this becomes the problem of today. And this is the central question of what this archives means from an international legal point of view. There is a law, whatever international law is, that says that a country that takes another country, and that's what America did, who captures another country, cannot steal its heritage, its documents, artwork. It cannot take it. And that becomes the central question of this, of why we're having this interview right now. The American government, when it came into Baghdad, took over sovereignty. There was no Iraqi government. And so the American government appointed people, mostly from the State Department, to represent the various ministries of the Iraqi government. One was the Cultural Ministry. And the American government signed an agreement with the American State Department official who ran the Cultural Ministry that the material could be taken out of Iraq, restored, and then should be sent back. Now, we have a bunch of questions here. I want to tell you that the American government took millions and millions and millions of documents about the Ba'athist, the Iraqi dictatorship, to the United States. They were never given back. They are the heritage, for better or for worse, of the Iraqi people. But the American government, there's no idea of giving that back. But why this? Why this?
Well, it's not it's not just this situation. You say this is international law, but anybody who's been to the Louvre, who's been to the British Museum, who's been to the Pergamon in Berlin, sees the treasures of the Middle East, of Iraq and Iran and Turkey, the Rosetta Stone and all the different reliefs of the palaces of Nineveh sitting in European museums. And is anybody asking for them back? Is there even a question that these museums are going to give them back to the original country? So if that's international law on one hand, on the other hand, let's get real. And so why this archive of all the things that are not at home around the world?
Well, the international law really that we're talking about here is, if I'm correct, post-World War II. And I think that it's just speculation on my part that the British, the Americans, the French, and the Germans didn't want to give back all of the things that they had in their museums. So it's only things that I think happened. If I'm correct, it's a Geneva Convention in 1949. I'm not a legal expert, so I may not have that exactly right. Now, I want to know, the real question is, did this belong to Iraq, the archives? And that is the central question here. Well, the American government, I want to tell you, invariably takes the pattern, often, the American State Department and a few other agencies, the path of least resistance. Well, this was found in Iraq, it belongs to the Iraqis, and so we return it.
Even though they had stolen it from the Jewish community that they had forced out.
They had exactly stolen it, is the right word. What happened is, what we know is, one day in the late 80s, as the Jews left, all of the communal material was taken and stored in the women's section, the upper section of the last functioning synagogue. I don't know what functioning means since there were so few Jews. And it was there. And all of a sudden, sometime in the early 1980s, and I know this from a woman who happened to have seen it as it was happening, at night, 2 trucks come up from the Iraqi government with soldiers. They go into the synagogue and they steal the heritage of the Jews of Iraq. Now, and they took it, and we had no idea where, and this is, we don't know where it was in the meantime, or did it go right to the security, the central office of security? Now, you might ask yourself, why would they want religious documents and things like this? The Middle East is a strange place at times, and there is a thought in general culture of the Middle East that if you have their patrimony, you have them. As if you own them. It's another way of putting down your enemy. Whatever the case is, the Iraqis stole it from the Jewish community. Imagine the few Jews that were left standing up to the Iraqis and say, "You can't take it." They would have been killed. No, they wouldn't have survived the moment. So it was stolen material. And who used this material, and whom did it belong to? It's the Jews who were forced out in 1949 through 51, who left, and again, maybe 85 to 90% came to Israel. And there's one other. To me, it belongs to them because it was theirs. Mm-hmm. It's as if saying, Eve, somebody wants something in your house, and the government decides for no reason just to nationalize your cutlery. Right. That's absurd.
Or some other things that have been in the news recently, or people still trying to get back artworks and other things that belong to their families that the Nazis stole during World War II. And there's still search for the provenance of a lot of different items. And these people are making a claim and getting, if they can get the Dutch museum or whoever happens to have it now, who aren't so willing to relinquish it, but if they can take it to court, some of them are getting it back. There have been films made about it. Yes. So did the Israeli government put in an official request to the American government in the name of the Iraqi Jewish community living here now that say have opened a museum to Iraqi Jewry and house it in there?
Not that I know of, no formal request, and I think that's a good idea. Because it therefore means if you're, and this is the American State Department especially, which says you spit in my eye, and I say, oh, it's raining. Or I, as a diplomat from this part of the world and other countries beside Israel, I decry something that the Americans have done, or I accuse the Americans, even though there's no evidence that I'm, and the American diplomat will say, oh, what did we do? How do we put it right? It's disgusting, if I could put it that way. Anyway, this would be, oh, you see, the Americans only took Iraq so they could steal Iraq's heritage and give it to the Jews. Wow. And so the State Department didn't want to have to deal with this. So what happened was, originally, in order to put this off, and the Iraqi government, because of inter-Arab politics and because of whoever would agree in the Iraqi government to let the Jews have their patrimony would be accused of being a Zionist spy, an Israel lover, or whatever like this, and it could endanger his life. So, in a very smart way, they came up with a solution that the material could be stay in the United States, and it could go around as exhibits and things like this. But then it would have to come back to Iraq.
So it's just like on loan in the United States, but it really belongs to Iraq. It's funny that you said Iran, because that's a whole other discussion, Freudian slip, that really may be today, partly due to the American total fail in Iraq and to set up an alternate government to Saddam in the vacuum that was left. Another discussion, as we said, for another day. Iraq has to some degree ceased to exist and Iran has taken over Iraq. So that's a whole other question, is to whom is this really going back to? So can it just remain like on permanent loan in America? And to circle back to that question, where does Israel fit in here? Why can't we make a request to the American government?
Well, here are a few thoughts. Number one, why is it scheduled now to go back again next in 2018? It's because the American government then signed an agreement with the Iraqis who resumed sovereignty after the American occupation ended, which, as far as I'm concerned, should have never happened in the first place. All we should have done is security, and just get all the Iraqis, different forces, and get them in a room to agree on something, and we forced them to do it, and we could have. I knew all of these people intimately. I'd worked with them for 12 years. But again, in the internal battle between the State Department on CIA on one side and the Pentagon and a few other places, it was I have my Iraqis and you have yours. It was terrible. It's bureaucratic infighting, and it is the norm, unfortunately, but it is the case. Anyway, that agreement that was signed in 2018, which in essence pushed the can down the road. The Iraqi government could be seen as benevolent and letting their material stay. Well, we can come up with another agreement similar to that, because a lot of the material, again, the American government has done an unbelievable job in restoring this. The American government paid for it in the end. Wow. I brought it to the United States, to the archives where they restored it, and the things that we have learned in this archives about the Jews, the Jewish community historically. We, for example, knew the names of famous Jewish leaders in the late 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s, famous rabbis, famous whatever, but we didn't know much about them. But in their holy books, there were notes, literally notes written on the pages by famous rabbis, then whose names, whose names we knew, but we didn't know much else. And we found actual signatures, pieces of paper, in copies of the Talmud that they had. And it is all now available on the net, that people can look at it. I think it's called NARA, which is National Archives, NARA, of the United States, /IJA, the Iraqi Jewish Archives is what the American government is calling. You can see they scanned it beautifully. They've done unbelievable things. So the answer is the information everybody in the world can have access to. That isn't the problem. But I want to tell you from personal experience, when the Soviet Union fell apart, I personally, my family, from the 1880s to the 1900s, immigrated to the United States from the area which is Latvia, Lithuania, and northwestern Belarus of today. And when the archives opened up, especially in Vilnius, the capital, today's capital of Lithuania, I was able to get a lot of information via, I would write and I would get, they would summarize the information which is there. And it was very moving to get about my own family history, all of that information. But in 1997, about 8 to 10 years after the Soviet Union fell apart, I myself went to the archives in Vilna, in Lithuania, and was able to physically touch all things that my 7, 8, 9, 10 generations ago ancestors, they themselves were either there when it was recorded or signed or things like this. And I cannot tell you what it meant. I got the actual copies of this. But to physically touch it, it is a very moving and deep experience that if this material is sent back to Iraq, no Iraqi Jew or their descendants could ever experience. Why do they need to suffer? How are Jews inferior people that they don't have the same rights as everybody else? I'm very grateful to the Lithuanian archives that I was able to actually touch and examine the material, not just get the summaries of it. And I think that the Iraqi Jews should have that same opportunity to see their books, their heritage. It does something enormously good for the soul. It's like going to see the Declaration of Independence. If in the United States you go and the first copy of the Constitution in Washington, it's kept under, you can't touch it. But you can go and actually view it. And the lines to this are long. You could call it just a dumb piece of paper that, everybody, you can get tons of copies of that. But the actual records themselves fill people's hearts with joy, with a warmth that you cannot describe in words. And this is what the Iraqi Jewish community, wherever they are in the world, deserve.
So with all your connections, both in Israel and the United States, are you in touch with somebody? Can you tell us maybe, and I don't want to mess anything up by perhaps you leaking something, but what can you tell us? Is there something going on here, or is this a done deal? And in a few months' time, this is all going back into the maws of people who will probably just chuck it into the furnace for all that they care about Jewish people, let alone the archives.
No one can read it there. No one knows Hebrew today in Iraq. Well, I have two answers to that. We went through this before about 5 years ago, if I'm correct, where we got this agreement to keep it in the United States for temporarily, whatever that word means. Well, that could be renewed because not enough people have been able to see it.
So an open-ended long-term loan.
We could limit it to another 5 years. There are ways of handling this. There are people who are much better than I am who would know. But here's another possibility. We are, if I'm correct, September, was it 16th today? 15th, okay. And the 10 days from now, on September 25th, the Iraqi Kurdish region, that is what is today northern Iraq, is going to vote on independence, whether they should be an independent country. And I have a lot of experience with the Kurds. Their attitude towards the Jews, to Christians, to Yazidis, to all this is very, very different than their fellow Muslims of Iraq, fellow Arab Muslims of Iraq. And if that area is independent, it is today part of Iraq, and it can be the former part of Iraq. Give it to the Iraqi Kurdistani government. That's part of Iraq by law, by international law, whatever that is. And these people will, I am sure, treasure it because they have a very, very good relationship with the Jews and the state of Israel. Now, I want to say, how do I know that? I personally, in 1970-71, studied in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University, and I lived with the chief rabbi of a city called Zacho, which is the northernmost city inside of Iraq today. And I lived with his family in a place called the Katamonim in Jerusalem. And I learned all about life of the Jews in that area. And they had nothing but the nicest things to say about the Kurds. Now, the Kurds are Muslims, but their attitude towards Jews...
They're Sunni Muslims?
They're Sunni, mostly Sunni. Overwhelmingly, there are some Kurdish, rather Shiite Muslims. They're called Faylis. The last, not the present Iraqi ambassador to the United States, his family name was even Fayli, Ismail Fayli. And they are Kurds who are Shiites. But they're, it all works. It all works. And that's another solution. Send them to, and therefore America would say, well, it's not violating international law by how it sees it. Question is, will America eventually recognize an independent Kurdistan, another oppressed people of the Middle East? They're oppressed terribly by Iran, terribly by the Arabs in Iraq and in Syria, and terribly in Turkey. And this becomes another interesting issue. and that is that Turkey today, according to the Interior Ministry figures in Turkey, it's probably 50-50% in Turkey today, Kurds and Turks. Publicly, Erdogan, the dictator of Turkey, says that by present demographic trends, it'll be by the year 2038. Well, he's off by 21 years. And the definition of a Kurd here, it doesn't matter what. If you say, Eve, you're an X, I can't tell you you're not. I could prove it logically. But it doesn't matter. People, when it comes to identity, feel what they do. And it's like the Arabs saying that the Jews have no right to the land of Israel, which they were thrown out of. Again, like the Iraqi Jews 2,000 years ago. And all they did was come back and resume sovereignty after 2,000 years, but they never, ever gave it up. Now, back to the Iraqi Jews. There is only one museum of Iraqi Jewish heritage in the entire world, and that is in a place called Or Yehuda, which is outside of Tel Aviv. And I've been in touch with these people for years. They would love this archives. And it would be available to anybody who would want to examine them. And the Iraqis could thereby feel that experience that I described for myself in Vilna. Mm-hmm. Now, I must tell you also that as an American Jew, but in this case as a Jew, when I found these things in Iraq, and I'm the one who worked with it in the beginning, I'm not responsible for the actual find. That really belongs to the phone call that Ahmed Chalabi made to me. He didn't. What did he care? Right. But he knew. But
you got this salvage operation going, and you yourself went in there and took the things out and made the right calls and made it happen.
I hope I made the right calls. All I can tell you is I think that from shall we say maybe from an emotional or a spiritual point of view, that you wonder why you're there. I know that most of the American government, the State Department, CIA, hated me because I believed in the mission that we were doing, that we were trying to establish an inclusive country where the Iraqi government would not be killing its citizens. And again, I believe and still believe to this day that it could have happened. But the American government was much more interested in having its Iraqis, people that they thought they could control. The American government, you can't control them. You can rent people by giving them money or something. But in the end, they're going to do what they want. And since Arabic is a secret language that almost nobody in the American government knows, so behind the scenes, they were doing all sorts of things. They were saying yes to the Americans and then doing other things. We chose the wrong people. And there were those of us who, at the time, again, in my case, and I do know Arabic, and I at one time had a basic knowledge of Kurdish. I wouldn't say I know Kurdish. You work for people for 12 years. It's like a marriage. Sooner or later, you have some knowledge of them. It doesn't mean you know everything, but you know a lot. And we tried. And the people like myself who didn't want an occupation, we failed. And I think that if we were able to establish an inclusive government, questions like the heritage of ex-Iraqis who were thrown out wouldn't have been a question. Can I be sure? No, that's a what-if situation. But I knew these people and I understood them, and we would have screaming arguments, and that's where you really find out what people think. And when you're out of control, yeah.
It could be that some Jews would have even gone to live in Iraq again, the way some Jews have gone to live back in Germany. And then you would have had a Jewish community to which to return it to, but you don't. That was terrible English, but you don't have that now. That's not going to happen.
Eve, this is a wonderful point because Iraq functioned so well as a society when the Jews that were there. Now, up until really even after World War I, the Jewish community of Baghdad was the largest community in Baghdad. It provided finance ministers. It had no stake in the inter-Arab rivalries that they had. And I dealt with a lot of Iraqis who said, Harold, the only way that Iraq ever functioned is when the Jews were here. Is there a way of us getting them back? And I had a simple answer. I said, and this was Ahmad Chalabi's answer as well. He said, if we have a free market economy here, that companies can come in and do business and make a profit. I said, I guarantee you that a lot of Jews will be coming to do that. I said, but
such an interesting point you're making, because people tend to look at the Arabs, the Muslims and the Arabs against the Jews, and the Jews bring the Arabs together because all the Arabs hate us. And what you're saying is that when the Jews were there in a society where a lot of the different Muslim factions or sects hated each other, the Jews were actually the bridge between all of them because we could work with all of them. It's so counterintuitive to what people would think today, and it's so sad. And look at the chaos that is created when countries throw their Jews out.
Well, it's a fact historically that when countries throw out their Jews, they decline. It may take 100 years or so, but I remember that an evangelical Christian at the Pentagon showed me on the net a T-shirt, and the T-shirt says, it's quoting Genesis in the beginning, where it says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. And then the T-shirt, in sort of a joking fashion, says, don't mess with us. Look what happens when you do. Where are the ancient Egyptians? Where's the great Hellenic Greek civilization? The Romans, where's Rome? It goes all the way up, excuse me, it goes all the way up to 20th century things. And at the very bottom, on it said Iran, ? Because Iran has done awful things basically to Israel and the Jews under the Islamic government. And the woman the evangelical Christian she wasn't concerned about Iran. She said, if Obama, who was the president at the time, continues to do these awful things to Israel, will this be America's fate as well, God forbid? And I can only say, and it is, you're not doing a program on politics, but there are a better group of people who are running the country, in my view, who are closer to American values, traditional values of the founding fathers. And that brings us back to the Iraqi archives, the Jewish archives again, because maybe just now the White House can intervene to stop the State Department from sending it back. Again, I cannot tell you the countless numbers of discussions that I've had, sometimes as the great Secretary George Shultz, who was the Secretary of State. I think he's in his late 90s at the moment, a wonderful man. He would bring American diplomats. A man would be appointed ambassador to, let's say, Turkey, because I know this, in fact, happened. And this man is appointed, and he brings in the newly appointed American ambassador to Turkey and says, in a big globe, he says, point to your country. And this particular guy pointed to Turkey. And Secretary Shultz turned the globe around. He said, no. I said, your country. Your country is the United States of America with American values. Now, what American values means here, that the Jews of Iraq and their descendants are the owners of the material stolen from, and that's where it belongs. I think under this administration in the United States, we have a better chance of having our voice heard.
Well, I certainly hope so, and that's a very optimistic note on which to end the interview. So thank you. We will come back to this. We'll see what happens, and hopefully your optimism will be well placed. Dr. Harold Rhode, thanks again for another wonderful interview. You're just a treasure trove. There's so many things to talk to you about. So everybody, you're probably going to be hearing me interviewing him again on a whole different topic, which I'm already cooking in my head. In the meanwhile, have a Rosh Hashanah, have a wonderful Jewish New Year,